First of all, I want to say thank you to Andrei Moisin, who invited Cameron to become a speaker on PWRAC. If you remember, one of our values is, or one of our commandments of PWRACer is to help us to recruit the speakers. So Andrei has been a great PWRACer. Cameron has been active member of Ruby community for almost 10 years, worked at Twitter. He's an author of a number of Ruby jams, wrote and still maintains Scuttle, was a speaker on many conferences, including RubyConf and RailsConf. And as I know, he got married 2 years ago, has a cat and a baby. And during the quarantine time, he's been especially adventurous in the kitchen. So he baked even pretzels. Today, he promised us to show how with almost no configuration, you can leverage Kubernetes to deploy your Rails app. Let's give a warm welcome of applause to Cameron Dutro from California. Cameron, let's check the audience and launch the poll before you start.
All right.
One.
Hey, everybody. Can you all hear me?
Yep.
Okay, awesome. Let me share my screen here. Okay, can everybody see my presentation? Okay, great. Okay, yeah, everybody, thank you so much for inviting me to speak. I have to say, it's quite an honor to be presenting next to such other pillars in the Ruby community, Jeremy and Luca, who are legends, and I'm kind of nobody compared to them. So thank you so much for having me on in the conference. Yeah, I'll wait for this poll to be done, but my sort of project in comparison to Hanami and Rhoda and Rodoth is a little different. You know, my project isn't really finished yet. It's kind of rough. I need your help. I'm kind of hoping to call your attention to how we can use Kubernetes to deploy Ruby applications. And I do have a lot of stuff working, but you know, it's a big problem. And so half of my job today is going to hopefully convince you that helping out with this project is a good idea. Cool. So I just got the poll results back. Yeah, it looks like most people are still deploying their, I shouldn't say still, are deploying their Rails applications on bare metal, so directly on a server. And then most people, looks like 67% don't have experience running or deploying into Kubernetes, which is no problem at all. But we're going to talk about how you can leverage these awesome technologies at your company or for your project. As Anna mentioned, I did just have a baby, and so that's one of the reasons why my open source contributions have kind of tapered off a little bit. She's kind of a handful, of course. So first of all, привет. I don't speak any Ukrainian, but I do have my Twitter profile in Cyrillic characters. I don't know if that counts for anything. But again, thanks everybody for welcoming me. So yep, Cameron Dutro. I work on the platform engineering team at Lumos Labs. I'm going to be there for a little bit longer before moving on to a company owned by Salesforce called Quip. So this is kind of my last week at Twitter, or at, not Twitter, at Lumos Labs, previously at Twitter. This is me with my wife at Giants Game. I live in the San Francisco Bay Area. And as Anna mentioned, I have a cat named Chester, and then we just had a baby named Ramona. She is, you know, about 6 months old now and growing all the time. And I thought I'd include two of my favorite pictures that I've ever taken of her, because she's kind of a funny little thing sometimes. Okay, so let's dive into the talk here. Based on the other panelists' questions that they asked that were popped up in the poll, I know that most people, I think 95%, are using Rails in some capacity. So that may be at their company, or that may be inside projects, or maybe both. And we know that Rails is awesome. A lot of people in the Ruby community know that Rails is awesome. And there's a bunch of reasons for that. Rails is really easy for beginners. Spinning up a Rails app, running migrations, all that stuff is super easy. It's got really cool tools for interacting with the database in the form of Active Record. Jeremy has SQL, and there's a bunch of other tools also out there, ROM, for example, that make working with databases in Ruby really easy. But especially in Rails, it's just something that's very straightforward. Most people love it when they first see it. It's maybe not the thing they stick with forever, but it's pretty great when you're first starting out. Rails makes it easy to rapidly prototype an application. It's easy to get your application written off the ground. And a lot of people have sort of demonstrated or shown that they really can move quickly with Rails. One thing that's also super nice that I think isn't talked about enough is there's a right place for every file in your application. Models directory, a controllers directory, a views directory. You can put stuff in lib. And it's just got a lot of other nice things too. So of course I talked about generators for certain plugins that you might want to use, like devise. Lots and lots of gems that solve just about every problem you might have in your app. And then it's got an amazing community. So, you know, Rails is really a pretty incredible framework. And I think a lot of us agree about that. In fact, some of us have been using Rails for about 10 years and still really enjoy using it. But there's a couple of problems that Rails has. And when I say a couple, I mean quite a few. And one of the biggest ones is when it comes time to deploy your application. So you've worked on your app. It's been easy. It's been fun. It's been great. You've been using Active Record. You're using controllers. All the files are in the right place. It feels great. And then you come to deploy and you realize that Rails really doesn't help you in this way at all. There's not a lot of tutorials about deploying. There's not maybe like a central place that every Rails developer knows to deploy to. There's no standard location. Like you could use Heroku, of course, and a lot of people do. But what are some problems with these other systems that are these deployment systems? So Heroku is great, but it's expensive, especially if you want to scale up. You could deploy on bare metal, EC2 instance, and Capistrano maybe. For a newbie though, that's pretty difficult to set up. You could do an EC2 instance with Chef, Puppet, and Ansible, but again, if you're just a beginner, you're not probably very well versed in Chef, Puppet, or Ansible. And there again is that EC2 instance that you have to configure and stand up and network with and all that. So I would almost call that basically impossible for a newbie to work with. You could use a really cool hosted solution like Beanstalk or Cloud66, which are easy and very smooth, but not free, right? So there's what I would call a hole sort of in the Rails story where deployment is not a super well described or well understood topic for a lot of people. This talk that I'm giving right now is inspired by an episode of the Ruby Rogues podcast, number 403, which was titled Rails Needs Active Deployment. And the guest was Stefan Wintermeyer from Germany. And he was discussing this exact problem. He said that in his experience, deployment is one of those things that normal Rails users don't understand. It's a big pain to set up a deployment system for a Rails application, and there's not much out there that makes it easier. He also said that he thinks that because of this, we lose a lot of companies and new developers at this point in the process. Everything else is so much easier with Rails, but that last step, that super important last step of deploying your application to production is still super complicated. So what I decided, what I took away from that talk was that there's just a lack of tooling and maybe a lack of good tutorials, and also like a lack of coalescing in the Rails community around deploying things in general. There are so many different options out there. And as I mentioned, some are paid, some are free. Some of them use hosted solutions, some of them are libraries, but most of the time, you know, it's not clear for most people, unless you're a really experienced DevOps person, it's probably not super clear to you how to move forward and what to do, and there's no real good, you know, trodden path that you should follow. And that's very unlike everything else in Rails. Everything else is convention over configuration. You want to access the database? Okay, there's a solution for that. It just works. You want to deploy though, and there's no solution for that built in, and it's up to you as a newbie or as, you know, an individual to figure out how to do that. So I want to lay down some solution criteria that I think would be or that I think is important that we cover if we're going to build a tool that does this in the Rails for Rails apps. So for one thing, I think that like the experience that you get with Heroku is really fantastic. So I would say that the solution that we come up with as a community should be as smooth and as easy as Heroku. I think the solution should be tightly integrated with Rails. It should be using Rails conventions and maybe adding some new conventions, so new opinions that make deployment easy and trotting that same path that other deployments have taken or other DevOps people have taken that are proven to work. So for example, using SSL or TLS certificates. I think convention over configuration is one of those really great parts of Rails that I think we should adopt also in a deployment solution. I think it should be open source, just like Rails is. I don't think it should be hosted because I think a hosted solution, they're often monetized. And not that I have a problem with monetization, but again, I think this should be something that any newbie can go use without having to sign up for any new accounts. They just install a gem and they're good to go. And I also would love the solution to work everywhere. And by work everywhere, I mean point your deployment script or your deployment code at an environment like DigitalOcean or Linode or EKS or something like that, and then have it just work. And I kind of hinted at the tech stack that I'm envisioning for this. So using Docker to package up your application, deploying it onto Kubernetes, and then some sort of deployment tool or gem that enables that to happen. So that takes your Docker container and tells Kubernetes to run it and then make it accessible over the internet. So today what I'd like to do is introduce, we'll talk a little bit also about Docker and Kubernetes, just in case you haven't used them before, aren't familiar with what they are. Just a really quick overview of these things before we move on. So what is Docker? Why would we choose it for something like this? And so Docker is a common application packaging format. So think of it as an envelope or a wrapper around all your code, dependencies, binary packages, things like curl and wget and all the other small binary tools that you would install with like apt-get or homebrew. All those things can be included in a Docker container or Docker image. So when you build a Docker image, it becomes a single artifact that you can push and pull around. Images are pushed to a repository. You can think of pushing an application and pulling it just like you would push and pull Git code or code via Git. Once an image is pushed to a registry, it can then be pulled down and executed. And once it's being run, a running image is called a container. One nice thing about containers is they're walled off from everything else, so they can't access any of the resources of your host machine. They only have access to a small slice of your machine that's in a jail essentially, or in a chroot. I like to think of it like this: a Docker image is like a class, and the Docker container is like an instance of that class. So in Ruby, you might have the class foo, and foo.new is the container. Okay, so what's Kubernetes? And why have we heard so much about it? Why is it such a big deal right now? So Kubernetes is a container orchestration framework. And orchestration means that it handles all of the various nuances around starting and running and keeping your application running. So yeah, it runs containers, it manages configuration and secrets. So configuration being those parts of your app that you might add to a YAML file, or you might add to your credentials.yaml. Those would be secrets that are encrypted. It provides networking between containers, and it manages things like routing, SSL, TLS, and more. So it's really the companion to Docker. So you want to run a Docker container, you of course could do that, but Kubernetes gives you all of these tools around running your container to make sure that it's highly available and always up. I like to think of Kubernetes like Ruby in our previous example. So it runs your script or runs your code, including creating instances, otherwise known as containers, from your classes, otherwise known as images. Without Ruby, you wouldn't be able to run your code. Ruby would just, you'd have a container, you'd have a script, but running it is Ruby's responsibility. So why would we use Docker at all? Why is it easy, sort of suited to this particular problem? So I mentioned a couple of things before this. The app is packaged once and can run everywhere. So that's a really big a really big point to using Docker, is that you can package once and run everywhere. That's kind of what other languages like Java promised a long time ago, but Docker really does work this way. It eliminates that it works on my machine problem, which I think is sort of an amazing step forward for application development. I personally have seen Docker images and running Docker images on my local machine just eliminate a whole class of problems around having to install dependencies and whatnot. It just sort of works. The image contains everything your app needs to run, and the entire thing can be built up in your CI environment and then pushed to a registry as an artifact. So it enables faster deployment for that reason. There's no messing around with installing all these dependencies on your own machine. They're all installed inside the container or inside the image. And it provides, because of that, easier scaling. I can go and deploy an application with Docker image much more quickly than I can if I'm using a bare metal server that I have to go in and configure. It's also becoming an industry standard, and therefore is compatible on a number of different machines, a number of different environments, a number of different cloud hosting platforms. For example, Amazon has a hosted container service called the ECS, or Elastic Container Service, that will run your Docker images. So like Kubernetes, but a little bit more simple. Okay, so why Kubernetes? We know why Docker's great. Why is Kubernetes great? Kubernetes is great because you can declaratively describe your infrastructure as a series of configuration files. Now, configuration files are also sort of an Achilles heel. In other words, they're also sort of a detriment or a downside of Kubernetes. But being able to declaratively say that this is what I want in my infrastructure, and then telling the computer to go do that and make that happen for you is really powerful. It's resilient to failure. If your containers stop running, crash for some reason, Kubernetes will restart them automatically. This is a lot easier than something like Supervisor D, where you have to write a special configuration file for it, and then hopefully make sure that it's still running also. So who watches the watcher? You can easily scale your resources up or down. So if I have my application that's running only with one instance of a container, then I can easily spin up another one and run that alongside and balance the traffic between those without having to set up any sort of HA proxy or Nginx in front of it. It provides a common layer on top of all these cloud providers, and I'll list a couple of those in a minute. Those cloud providers could be as diverse as Azure and AWS. And it's also rapidly becoming an industry standard. A lot of people are using Kubernetes now. It's becoming a lot more popular. But why not Kubernetes? There's also some problems with it. So I mentioned that lots of dense config files, but also there's a pretty steep learning curve. And I don't think it's particularly beginner friendly. It's also very unopinionated. Kubernetes is sort of a system that's meant to be driven by some other system. So if you're deploying an image into it, a Docker image into it, and you want that Docker image to run as a container, it requires a lot of messing around to get that to work. It's also probably the most heavily technical documentation I've ever read, which can be really dense and hard to read, especially if you don't already understand the terms they're using in the documentation. And then something that Stefan mentioned in that Ruby Rogues episode is that there's also a lack of comprehensive tutorials for Rails devs. And he said that a year ago. That may have changed, but I haven't been able to find that many about deploying an app into Kubernetes myself. So I think it's still a need. So here's an example of why Kubernetes may not be that friendly. And I will show you, this is a config for a sample app. This is actually what my little tool generated for a brand new Rails 6 application with only one controller, and all it says is hello. It's a lot of configuration, and especially if you don't understand what this is even doing, it's not particularly feasible for most developers or most, especially beginner engineers without a DevOps background to really dive in here and make something actually work with Kubernetes. I looked at this initially when I was first getting started with Kubernetes, and it made me sort of, my eyes glazed over, and I just was like, I don't know if I'm ever going to understand this. I don't think I actually cried, but I probably was doing this on the inside. So I want to introduce to you today this project I've been working on for a little while called Kuby. So Kuby, a combination of Kubernetes and Ruby. Kuby is supposed to be, it hits all the points, or at least I would like it to hit all the points that I described at the beginning in that criteria section. It's supposed to be as slick as Heroku, and it's supposed to use Kubernetes under the hood so you can deploy just about anywhere. So what does it do? It packages up your application using Docker. You don't have to have a Docker file or write all that yourself. It automatically will create a Docker file for you. It follows Rails conventions, so it will deploy your secrets that exist in your credentials.yaml file. It deploys those into Kubernetes. It stands up a database using config from database.yaml, and it will automatically fetch, configure, and install TLS certificates using this thing called cert manager from Let's Encrypt. So without having to do almost any work, you could stand up your website that does all of this stuff and sort of just works, just like Heroku. You can also deploy it to any place that supports Kubernetes. So if you can create a Kubernetes cluster in your cloud provider of choice, then you can probably use Kuby to deploy to it. The current providers that I have already written for Kuby are for DigitalOcean and Linode, but it would be easy, or at least straightforward to write providers for AWS EKS or Fargate Azure and Google's Kubernetes engine. So I put a star here. It doesn't support these exactly at the moment, but I'm hoping to add support for those in the near future. But the best thing about Kuby, at least in my opinion, is that it requires almost no configuration. And another way to say this is it requires hardly any configuration. You don't have to write dense YAML files. You don't have to write a Docker file. All you have to do is something like this. So we'll go over each part of this, but I want to leave it up on the screen for a little while in case people are curious. They want to sort of parse through this with their own with their own eyes, I guess. So the top level, we have a kuby.define, and this is going to say this is creating a Kuby definition for your application. This might go, by the way, in config initializer as kuby.rb in your Rails app. So the first section here is the Docker config, and it's a DSL. It's a pretty, I would say, pretty standard or pretty it's not a super nested DSL, so there's not a lot of messing around with what can I possibly call here. We have an outer Docker block, credentials. We define a username and password. This is for pushing your image to a registry. And I should have mentioned before, I usually have used GitLab for this because GitLab's registry is free. You would also choose a distro for your Docker file. In this case, I chose Debian. That was the operating system, or it's the runtime, I guess you'd say, or the base image that we're using for our Docker file. And then the image URL, as I mentioned, is for GitLab. So the idea here is that we'll build the Docker image and then push it to GitLab, and then Kubernetes will be able to pull it down and run it. The next section is the Kubernetes config. So we're gonna, everything in Kuby for the most part is implemented as a plugin. So we'll say add plugin Rails app, and we'll give it a host name. Now, configuring the host name, or pointing your domain name, I should say, at your hosting provider is a little bit of a different story than or a little bit more difficult than just doing this in your code, but that's also not too difficult. But as long as you can associate your host name with your running Kubernetes instance, and you have your DNS entries pointed at your hosting provider at your load balancer, then you should be fine. And then the last part of this is defining what provider you want to use. So in my case, I chose DigitalOcean for this demo or for this presentation, and define your access token, which DigitalOcean provides you, and the cluster ID. So this is my Kubernetes cluster that I have stood up in DigitalOcean. Okay, deploying then is really easy. Just say you use rake tasks, Kuby build and Kuby push. Those things will build your Docker image locally and then push it to your registry. You could also do this in CI. And then it will run Kuby deploy. You'll run Kuby deploy after that, which will use that configuration that we already defined to deploy your application into your Kubernetes cluster on DigitalOcean. So one of the nice things about a DSL like this is that you can enable a lot of really easy changes. So for example, let's say that I'm pushing these Debian images around, and they're kind of big. They're almost a gigabyte large. Let's say I want to slim things down and use Alpine. Well, no problem. I just change from Debian to Alpine. I don't change anything else, and my image builds, and I can push up a much smaller image now to my registry. Let's say that I want to migrate my application from DigitalOcean to Linode. Maybe I got some good coupons or something from Linode, or they're just cheaper, and I want to use them instead. Well, no problem. I can just change provider DigitalOcean to provider Linode. I probably need to change the access token and the cluster ID as well, but those are the only couple of things I need to change. And now, because everything is just Kubernetes under the hood, I can deploy my application onto Linode. Again, I have to switch my DNS, but that's a chat for another day. So how does it work under the hood? Well, the architecture is, I mentioned, plugin based, and there's lifecycle events. So the Rails app, for example, has an after configuration and a before deploy lifecycle event that it can hook into. It's generating YAML files and Kubernetes resources and then applying those. And then Docker images are built in phases. So there's a bundler phase, an assets phase, et cetera. And then all the Kubernetes resources are defined as Ruby objects under the hood. I'll give a couple of examples of this. So here's a custom Docker phase. The thing I'm trying to highlight here is that all of this is just Ruby. So in my Docker block under kuby.define, I can insert, let's say I'm trying to pull the MaxMind GeoIP database. This is a made up URL, by the way. But I want to apply this to my Docker file. So I define a class, I define a method called apply_to, it's passed a Docker file object, and then I can run commands or copy things or whatever I want to that Docker file. And then I would use it by saying insert, new up, and create a new instance of this thing, and say I want to do this after the copy phase. So in other words, after I've copied all of my application's files into the Docker container. It's also making use of this gem that's part of Kuby called kubedSL. You can define Kubernetes resources using a Ruby DSL. So in this case, we're defining a service account. You can see that the whole thing is just written as code. And this is what Kuby is doing under the hood to create all that configuration that you saw on one of the slides before. So that's basically it. It's just plain old Ruby. But as I said before, or I need your help, and imagine what we could do with a framework like this. We could enable background jobs with Rescue and Sidekick. Again, just in that kuby.rb file, we can enable that kind of thing as a plugin. We could enable caching, automatic caching with Redis and Memcache, and then set your Rails config to point to those. We could enable Prometheus metrics. We could enable cron jobs and a bunch of other things, all sort of with the minimal configuration that you would need in production. Here's the URL to the organization that I set up for this. We've got github.com/getkuby, and I need your help. I need lots of people to test this and in all these environments so that we know that it's going to be, so that it matures and it's more robust enough we can use it and tell people that it's working for all these diverse use cases. And that's it, really. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much for that beautiful presentation. Kudos for name of the project. That's really awesome. And we are looking forward to hear a podcast about Kuby because you have really beautiful voice.
Oh,
so
thank you.
The next thing to do would be to write the same podcast for Rubyroids with 1 hour talk about Kuby. And let's go to the questions as we do not have too much time. First of all, the question would be, why do you decide to spend your time on Kubernetes if there is a nice Docker swarm out of the box that comes with Docker and give you almost everything you need for your deployment?
Oh, that's interesting. So the question is, why would we not use Docker Swarm for this?
Yeah, it is.
Yeah, that's a good question. So being I'm not a particularly what's the word? I didn't grow up as a DevOps person. Most of my work has been as an application developer, and so most of my experiences with that, and I haven't used Docker Swarm. That being said, I did talk to one of our DevOps people at Lumosity a while ago, and that person didn't like Docker Swarm, and so I think we just ended up not using it. I do remember though, sort of reading stuff about it. So unfortunately, my answer is just like I haven't really used it, but I have used Kubernetes a lot, and I really like Kubernetes. So that's why I'm presenting on that today.
Okay, thank you for that answer. And unfortunately, we don't have much time for all of the questions. So that would be the last one. Why, when you are going to Dockerize your Rails application, what is the correct way, in your opinion, to deal with your assets? Do you build them during creation of your image, or do you build them on startup of the image? And how do you deal with the delays that may produce? And how do you serve them from the Rails application or from the Nginx container somehow outside?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's something that I haven't set up yet. What it's doing right now is it just builds the images it builds the assets, I should say, into the Docker image, and then those get served by Rails itself. Obviously, that's not great. I'd love to make that better. The ideal solution, I think, would be to serve them with Nginx. So in Kubernetes world, there's this thing called an ingress, and that's usually, for most people, that's running something called Nginx ingress. So it's running Nginx under the hood. And so what I would do probably for that is set up a special route, to /assets that would serve out of the public assets folder. Or you could potentially also upload all those files to S3 or some other CDN and serve them from there. So haven't set that up yet, but definitely would. I'm just trying to, there's so many little things to think about and worry about. I just haven't gotten to that yet, but I would love to. And I would definitely recommend or welcome a pull request if you're wanting to set that up.
Yeah, so you heard that call to action. Just go to GitHub and for the Kuby. Thank you for all the answers. And that's time for the next step.
Yeah, again, thanks everyone. There were 3 awesome talks. And let us give one more round of applause for Jeremy, Luca, and Cameron. Like, it's still so hard to me because I can't hug everyone. You know, who knows Pivarak? We have another name for us called not Pivarak. Rak is a crayfish, but Piva hug because we hug a lot. So this event won't be possible without not only speakers, but without the Pivarak core team. They really deserve a round of hugs and hearts in chat. Please, everyone, say thanks to our volunteers in the chat. And I have a couple of news here. Giveaway from our sponsor and partner, ONA, has a winner, and the name is Denise Medensky. Denise, you now can read more books during this lockdown time, so congratulations. And also, I got some great numbers. As you remember, we had 8 partners today, 8 supporters, 8 companies that sound in total support the community for $1,890 before the event. And during the event, we're able to collect $250 more. So again, thank you so much for being an awesome community and help us to support in this uncertain times. So, party is over, but here comes what? The after party. Our idea was to connect the activists from Ruby communities around the world. And I'm so proud that we have special guests from Minsk, Berlin, Warsaw, Rome, Wrocław, Ljubljana, Vienna, Lviv. Imagine now that this Friday you have 7 bars to choose from. Each bar has its own barkeeper and own specialty. So what I'm gonna do right now, give me a second. I'll share the link in the chat. Ba-bam! Hit the link, choose the one you like, and join the room. For me, it's the first Pivarak online event, and I'm so happy to have you all on board. Thank you so much, and grab your drinks. I have mine. And see you in the after party bar.